thank you so much for being here. And this is Hiring for Good, Acumen Executive Search podcast. I'm going to turn it over to my coworker, Tanis, to kind of lead through this conversation.
Yeah. This morning, we are having a conversation with Stan Hanks. And, Stan, you had so many different titles that I wasn't exactly sure the best way to introduce you title-wise.
I usually go with Troublemaker.
Troublemaker. Okay. Well, then lead Troublemaker, Stan Hanks, who, our conversation here is about hiring for good, but we always begin by asking our guests to just kind of tell us a little bit about their background. And before you even do that, I just want to say, Suzanne doesn't know everything about your background. And so I'm going to just share with the audience and with Suzanne that when I first sat down next to Stan and started talking to him about his background, I thought maybe I was being punked and there was a hidden camera somewhere, because I have rarely encountered someone with such a fascinating story to tell. And if we only get through your story, it's going to be one of the best episodes we ever have. So take it away. Tell us who you are.
I'll just start. I'm from Texas originally. Mm-hmm. And I don't sound like it because I spent a very long time working on that.
Oh.
But
so the question is East Texas or
West Texas? When you see the financial news and you hear about West Texas Intermediate, as a young boy, I was riding around in my dad's utility company truck as he was wiring the power meters to the pumps that pull that stuff out of the ground.
Wow.
It was literally 20 miles from my house, right? Okay. And so I wound up at Rice University. I have undergraduate degrees in computer science, electrical engineering, and applied math, and a minor in art. Wow. And a graduate degree in computer science. I was a researcher in the early days of distributed computing, and wound up one day my advisor walks in and drops this giant pile of documents on my desk and says, "There's this ARPANET thing." So I wound up on the team that debugged the TCP/IP network protocol and actually made it work. And then in '83, I co-wrote the code that opened the ARPANET up to National Science Foundation funded schools. And in '86, I was on the National Science Foundation Task Force for Commercialization of the Internet.
Let's back up for the people who don't know exactly what we're talking about, because this is it.
I can translate. Stan invented the internet.
Well, no, I didn't invent it. I just wrote some of the code and fixed other people's code.
Bugged it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it was there's probably 200 of us involved in the whole thing. It wasn't like a solo effort, but it was. Seriously, I've still got my 1981 ARPANET phone book, and it's 8.5 by 11 paper, typed, not even laser printed. Double-sided, and it's got the names, physical addresses, and telephone numbers of everyone who has an email account on an ARPANET-connected computer. It's like less than a quarter of an inch thick. There's probably 1,000 names in it. Wow. That was literally everyone that was on the internet in 1981. And now it's 7.2 billion connected devices. Yeah. The decisions we made about how to design some of this stuff, it's a miracle it works at all. Yeah. We thought that like maybe 100,000 devices tops. Right?
So I know we're going through your background, but I just have 1,000 questions.
Suzanne, wait, we're just getting going.
I know. Wait.
I'm telling you,
I want to know this.
Forrest Gump.
So give me one example that you are shocked, a decision you made then that is still being held true today. Because again, the framework is still there.
It's all there. One of the biggest ones that we got right and wrong at the same time was identity, because we made it at the time. The government was breaking up AT&T, and the phone company is looking over the wall at what we're doing, and they're kind of rubbing their hands and saying, "How can we turn this data thing into something we can charge for?" Mm-hmm. Right? And one of the critical things that we decided is to not put unique identifiers on transactions on data flows. So you can't say, if you don't know who it is, you don't know where it's coming from, where it's going, you can't assess a bill for it. And if a whole bunch of users get aggregated into a single point, how do you pick them? So we made a bunch of affirmative decisions in the design not to include that. And the technical justification was that the ability to do that computationally, we just didn't have the horsepower to do it. It would slow everything down. And the further justification was that it would limit people's ability to innovate. And that all proved to be completely true. And here we are today, and nobody knows if you're a dog.
Right.
I mean,
well, or the flip side is, I think you start with these great intentions, and then people take advantage of.
well, so there's a bit of that too. I'm a hacker. I am perpetually a 3-year-old sitting in front of an outlet with 2 bobby pins going, I wonder what would happen. I take stuff apart just to see what's inside, and then I poke at it in ways that I'm positive the designers never envisioned. And that was true for a significant number of us back then. And we had a pretty good imagination about how things might go, but we didn't know, right? And over the course of time, we got proved wrong time and time again as stuff just went sideways.
Oh, I'm sure.
And and then of course then we'd fix it and then we'd go on but there's so much of this stuff we just never foresaw, right? I mean, I remember being on a closing panel with George Gilder in 2000 at a conference put on by one of the semiconductor manufacturers. And in 2000, Gilder's talking about how these things are going to become the center of our life, that we won't actually have computers anymore, that your computer will be your cell phone, and that you'll walk in and set it down on a pad, and it will connect via Bluetooth to a keyboard into your screen, and then when you leave, you take it with you, and you can do all the same things on the go. And I'm thinking, yeah, probably. And everybody else in the audience is like, no fucking way that's going to happen. It's just like wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And yeah, guess
right.
what? He was right. 6 years later, we get the iPhone, and the world changes. And it's just fascinating to see how wrong we were about so many things, and at the same time how right the decisions were not to try to artificially constrain what you can do.
Right.
Because it enabled, the future that we live in.
Yeah.
Well, and you said one of the goals was to increase innovation, and if you more constraints, that makes total sense.
Right.
So we're only getting started.
I know,
Suzanne.
we're
I'm sorry, this is the
We
first
are in the end.
just buckle up, okay?
Yeah. So I wound up. People that use the kind of high performance computation that I worked on in the 80s were 3-letter agencies, medicine, and oil companies. And I wound up doing the math involved in doing underground 3D seismic exploration and rendering MRIs is almost the same.
So going through the earth versus going through the
Well,
brain.
it's just the data that you accumulate and the specific computations that you do to
That makes
deconvolve
sense.
it and render it into an image. It's almost exactly the same. So I wound up doing a lot of work in both of those. I led a computer science research team for Shell Oil for a number of years, moving them into distributed computing and away from like Cray supercomputers and IBM mainframes. And I worked in medicine. I was a technical director at the W.M. Keck Center for Computational Biology in Houston for a couple of years. And it's fascinating that you wind up in these places I never had a career path. I never had a goal. I never said I'm going that way. I just looked at the next most interesting thing that came up and said, well, let's go do that. So I was chief scientist for a computer company that made supercomputers that were desk side as opposed to data center. I did a lot of work in seismic exploration. I did some work in satellite imaging. I did some stuff I can't talk about. And eventually one day I'm working for this oil company and I'm running an R&D group, and I come in and there's this funny looking little guy with a bad tweed suit and round glasses and a briefcase. He is clearly not in the right place. And I say, can I help you? And he says, well, I'm from corporate. And I knew that the company was in the process of being purchased by a company in Connecticut. And I said, oh, so you're from Teleco? And he says, no, I'm from Southern Natural Gas. And I'm like, And he says, yeah, they bought Teleco around the time they were buying you. And I'm like vastly puzzled by this. And he says, and here's your new paperwork because your R&D group is now a profit and loss center. And I'm like, he said it's a P&L center. And I'm like, great, what's P&L?
Yeah,
Right.
I'm a scientist.
Right? And he explains to me that the new vogue in funding research in corporate America is rather than allocating a percentage of your gross revenues towards the future, that you actually have to go into the company and find people that are operators and get them to sponsor your version of what needs to come next. Oh. And I'm like, so I don't have a budget? And he says, well, no, you got a target, but you still have to get people to agree to fund it. And I'm like, well, what happens if they don't? And he's like, well, we'll have to, cut projects and fire people. And I'm like, wait. And I said, well, can I get money from people that aren't inside the company? And he thought about it for a while. And he says, well, yeah, except for people on this list. And that conversation changed my life because I discovered that it was way more interesting to figure out how to get people to give me money for technology than to just create new technology. Mm-hmm.
And so looking back, when you say that was such again, you were at a crossroads, you went left versus right. Would you have changed it or
Oh, not at all.
Not at all. So this was
This is very pivotal. I still, have created a lot of technology since then, but it's not like I've stopped, but the focus shifted because I realized that as an academic researcher, we had grants, and until I started writing grants, it was like as a grad student, I'm just like, oh, free money, right? People are paying me to do cool stuff, and that money came from somewhere, right? How did it wind up here? And then as I start writing grants, I'm like, it's slightly less opaque, but it's still pretty opaque. Mm-hmm. Please give me money to do this cool thing, and you put it in an envelope and you send it off, and money comes back. And it's like, it's different in the commercial world. I've created a thing. It's my vision. I've created this thing. It's wonderful. Please buy it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I didn't bother to talk to anybody about it. I didn't bother to see if anybody else is interested in this. I've just created this thing.
And it's almost like in a bubble all by itself. And
well, you just didn't know how to think about it in that way yet, right? Well, now you realize this is valuable.
Well, and a lot of what I do with advising companies and startup founders is to not do that, to figure out what the market actually is before you build the thing. Yeah. Because if you build the thing and it's the perfect thing for you, well, that's one, right? You need to go from 1 to 100 to 10,000 to 10 million.
Right.
And if you don't talk to people, that's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. Which is a problem for a lot of technologists because many of them are just deep introverts. Mm-hmm. And the idea of coming out of the code cave and going and talking to strangers is anathema. But so through the late 80s and early aughts, I got involved in telecom. I was very interested, and I was still helping people build internet companies and working on high-speed fiber optic communications and line-of-sight laser communications, which is basically the same thing without the fiber optics, and cryptography. And I wound up picking up a consulting project for a company that was interested in having fiber optic cable locally under their control, and it was impossible to get. Mm. And I met a gentleman who had a company in Houston that actually owned a bunch of fiber optic cable, and that they were trying to sell, at that point, what was called bypass services, so that you buy a leased line from your PBX to the long-distance carrier, so you don't pay the local phone company for your long-distance calls, right? Extremely lucrative, but he had all this fiber, and he also was interested in data, and he put together this working group, and I showed up, and in the middle of it, I realized I knew how to solve this problem. Mm-hmm. And that's where I invented IPVPNs. So
wait, let's pause right there. You invented what?
IPVPNs, the virtual private networks, VPNs. You got a VPN on your phone. So
I just wanted to pause so people heard that.
Yes.
That started in a conference room in Houston, Texas in 1991. Wow. And I later turned that into an internet standard for a protocol called GRE, which is the basis for every following VPN structure that happened. And so I helped them build their business. They took a direction that I was uninterested in pursuing because they bet wrong, and I knew it, and I wasn't interested in sticking around for that. Wound up doing a bunch of more consulting, started a company that built a work-from-home platform in 1994. Right.
Wow.
We moved enough people home for compact computer that they didn't have to build a $43 million building.
Wow.
Right. And we're basically doing this with stone knives and bearskin.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The internet, as most people understand it, didn't really exist at that point in
Yeah.
time. And I was doing this with a lot of arcane phone company technology
Wow.
and some.
And it was like an intranet.
Well, yeah. So I invented some software that made it possible for you to walk up to a desk on campus and pick up the phone and dial in a code, and all of a sudden, this is your desk. The
Wow.
Ethernet connection is connected to your local work group. The printer that's your local printer is the one on your secretary's desk, wherever that is.
In what year? 1990?
93, 4.
Wow.
Right. And more importantly, that phone now has your 4-digit extension.
Yeah.
Right. And that I could also do that at home. So we were doing some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
And I wound up going through a fairly brutal divorce, like right at that time, and wound up at loose ends. And I got recruited to run network engineering for a company that was being put together by the Bechtel Corporation. Riley Bechtel, one of the seniors, the oldest son, was sitting in cigar bars in San Francisco, and all of his friends are .com this and .com that. And he's like, I got bulldozers. And not very sexy. And he wanted a .com company, and the board agreed to build an internet company, but only if it was infrastructure focused as opposed to Flappy Bird, right? Flappy Bird didn't exist then.
Yeah.
I was going to say that.
That's my metric for silly things that nobody
Bells and
saw
whistles.
coming.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we put the company together, and before we really got online and really engaged, we had a bunch of data centers and a bunch of capacity in place and stuff. They sold us to GTE, and I was at loose ends again. And I was doing some consulting in the Bay Area, and I got a call from some old friends at Enron. And they said, you've done a lot of security work for us and network performance work for us. And we bought Portland General, and they've got this unregulated subsidiary that's trying to build a fiber optic network. And we don't know if we should let them do it, if we should kill it, or if we should put a bunch of money into it. And could you go figure that out for us? And I came up and gave them eventually a business plan for creating a commodity market for bandwidth. And that was also based on some research I'd done in the early 90s and had a different way of kind of looking at things. And they liked it a lot, and they agreed to put $2 billion into the company. And Enron Broadband was. They gave me adult supervision. I wound up with a CEO that had been a senior executive at Enron, and our chief legal counsel and head of finance were all people that were like coming from the inside. But we built this local out of people that were in basically telecom and the internet and cutting edge software stuff, and it was great. Enron gets a bad rap for a lot of things. They weren't named the most innovative company in America 5 years in a row for nothing.
Yeah.
I literally had Netflix in 1998.
Jeez.
I had broadcast quality video on demand of anything that you wanted. What I didn't have was studio buy-in because we didn't have digital rights management. So there was no way that I could only send it to the person that had paid for it and prove that they paid for it and have them not send it to somebody else. And the studios were like, this is awesome, but you need to fix that bit, right? And of course, all that died when Enron crashed in 01. But it was a blast. And then in early 2000, some stuff happened that I took exception to, and the Department of Justice later took even greater exception to, and a bunch of people went to prison. But I decided I was done, and I left, and I wound up going to work for. As an entrepreneur in residence for a couple of venture capital firms. Now, while I was at Enron, one of the things that happened is that as a chief technologist, I their venture capital group rolled up to me. So I was heavily involved in their venture capital arm and the investments that they made. So at that point, I had raised money from venture capitalists and private investors, and I had operated companies and had some exits, and I now am running corporate venture capital, and then I moved into being an entrepreneur in residence at venture capital, institutional venture capital, where I'm helping them make allocations. And also was a limited partner in some of their funds. And the loop on that closed in early 2002 after Enron died. I got a phone call. I get this phone call from this crazy guy up here in Vancouver, Washington. And my phone rings. I'm playing golf in Scottsdale, and I didn't have my ringer off for some reason. My phone rings. The guys I'm playing with look at me like, "Are you going to answer that?" And I answer it, and he says, "You don't know me, but we should talk." And I'm like, holy wow, that's what a way to open a conversation. I mean, this is like you have pictures of my wife with a Trailblazer. Yeah. You're calling about my extended warranty. I mean, it's like, so he tells me that he's an investor and that he's decided he wants to buy all of the assets of Enron Broadband out of bankruptcy. And the people in Houston told him that since I'd built most of it, I know where all the bodies are buried. And since I'm literally in his backyard, I still lived in Southeast Portland, that he should talk to me. And so I said, "Yeah, I'd love to help you." And he says, "Well, I've got a meeting in Houston tomorrow at 2 p.m. Could you be there?" And I'm like, "Sure, I'll bite. I'm happy to be there." And then he said, "Well, I'm in Reykjavik right now, and I've never been to Houston before, and I don't know my way around. Could you pick me up at the airport and take me to the meeting?" And I'm dying over here, right? "Yeah, I'm happy to do that." So I fly into the South Airport and get a car, and I drive up to the North Airport, and I pick him and his general counsel up and drive him to downtown, and we're up on the 20th floor, and it's old home week. I know all these guys, and they're, "How's your wife and kids, and what about your dog, and did your son win the, And then we sat down, and he says, "Well, now that we have all got to know each other a little bit, I don't want to waste anybody's time. I propose that I buy all of the assets right now with no further due diligence, full assumption of risk, for $8 million. And he pulls a checkbook out of his vest or his coat pocket and lays it on the table and picks up the pen. And these guys collectively shit themselves.
Yeah.
Because they're making like 3x their normal salary as a retention, and they've got liquidation bonuses and all kinds of stuff. And they're like trying to turn this into a 3-year gig. And this guy walks in and like in the first 5 minutes says, "We're going to send you home," right? And he doesn't realize this.
Yeah.
And I'm watching this unfold, and I'm thinking, the balls.
Yeah.
Right? And it had a predictable outcome. Yeah, I would love to do this, but we have to do it through a process and this and that and the other. And we flew back home, and he said, "I'd really like to hire you to run this process for me." And I said, "Well, what are you going to do with it once you've bought it?" And he says, "Well, I figured you'd tell me that."
Oh my gosh.
And so I went to work for him. I was there for 17 years. We did not succeed in that acquisition, but instead we bought a transatlantic fiber optic cable that had been built by 360 Networks, and then we spent 4 years turning that up so that it actually worked and turning it into a business and acquiring phone companies and building a fiber to the home cable TV company in Dublin, and I mean, it was a blast. We did so much fun stuff. And along the way, we bought and sold a bunch of companies, and I wound up with companies that had gone into bankruptcy that I just got cold assets that I got to figure out how to turn into something. And sometimes we'd buy operating companies and figure out how to merge them. And so I did that for about 15 years. And then we sold our last asset in telecom in 2017. And Ken said, "It took me 15 years to get out of aluminum, and it took me 15 years to get out of telecom. I don't have another 15-year project." And I gave him some suggestions, and he gave me a pile of money to go make some venture capital investments. And I did that, and they were very successful. And while I was doing that, I fell in love with one of the companies and joined them as an executive and was off doing another thing. And then after a couple of years of that, an old colleague of mine back from the Enron days approached me about starting a investment fund with him to invest in companies that are creating actual science-based hard technology as opposed to, once again, Flappy Bird. And so I invented a new class of fund that it was not a venture capital fund. Actually, we invested in the patents. And you're taking it
IP.
right. So we own the IP. We had rights in the monetization of the IP, but we under the SEC what's called soft money rules, you can make these additional investments to improve the value of your core investment. So we'd go on the cap table like a venture capitalist. So we'd write them a venture capital style check to build the company,
Right.
while we've also written them a check against the IP. And we're running the whole process of perfecting the IP and licensing it and all the things, right?
That's
Wow.
fascinating. Yeah.
And I know at a certain point you didn't mention, but you did tech transfer. So were you sort of, it was somewhat of a similar model?
It was a very similar model. I mean, back when I was at the Keck Center for Computational Biology at Baylor College of Medicine, I was required to start a consulting company because the benefits for faculty were horrible, because almost all the faculty were MDs and they were writing their own benefits package through their clinical practices. And the head of HR is like, "Yeah, you're not an MD, are you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, no, as it turns out. What do I do?" And she says, "Well, maybe a consulting practice."
Right.
So I started this consulting practice, Technology Transfer Associates, and that's literally what we did. We scouted universities, and this was before the Bayh-Dole Act. So
right, and before Stanford, probably all that stuff, right?
And we're super early days scouting stuff that we think is going to be in. Would make licensing deals with the universities, and then we had a selection of corporate clients that had stuff that they were kind of interested in, and we were basically playing matchmaker and skimming off the top on each transaction. But so I'd done tech transfer, and then at Enron, I had a vision for the future that was not necessarily the same as people that were running, internet companies, because we had a giant network that was built the way that you'd build an internet backbone, but we carried no internet traffic. It was just our traffic for our services. So I had needs that were different. So I'm scouting people that have got, that's some interesting research over there, and that's a little startup company that if I twist them just a little bit and give them some money. So I'm trying to create this future that wouldn't exist otherwise.
Yeah.
Right?
We kind of talked about how life is never a straight line, and how what you think at college graduation or high school graduation or what have you, this is where I'm going to end up. And life just takes you go, but it's all about taking that leap of faith.
I knew with the certainty that only a teenager can have what my life was going to be like. I went specifically to Rice University because they had an MD PhD program. And I went because one of the professors, Arne Trollstra, was working on synthetic vision. He had this thing where he had a contact lens the size of a ping pong ball and an analog video camera and a bunch of computer gear. And he could induce vision. You could see shapes with what he was doing. He would basically take the input from the camera and digitally process it and stimulate your brain. And I'm like, I want that. And the $6 Million Man had been on TV, right?
Sure.
And my thing was I really wanted to work in cybernetic technology. I wanted the digital,
The bionic,
the
yeah.
bionic thing.
Sure.
And I was, by God, going to do that. Well, so it turns out I didn't. Arnie left in my second year, and his group disbanded, and the guy that took over running the bioengineering group was a cardiac guy, and he just wasn't as interesting. And I discovered I'd been building programs, in high school. People think about programming in schools these days, and they've got laptops and writing code in Python and stuff. I had a computer that had switches and had 256 bytes of memory.
Oh my gosh.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
And so figuring out how to write control systems and stuff. and I'm writing it all in machine language and hand coding in the ones and zeros. And when I got to Rice, I discovered programming languages, and my world kind of expanded a great deal. And I got involved in really complicated programming projects. And then I discovered networks, and it was just like, whew, this giant left turn, right? And I kind of came back because I've been involved in a lot of biotech startups, and I just can't stay away from it.
It's not too late. You can end up with your.
But it's so, but at every turn, I'm minding my business, going on down my path, and I see something, I go, oh wow, and the next thing I know, I'm doing that.
Well, I love it. And here's something interesting. So, I think traditionally in a space where there are people who write a lot of code and kind of you can get your head a little buried and really be in your lane, it can be difficult to develop and cultivate the skill set of management, of communicating the efficacy of these ideas to lay people. And, did you always inherently possess that skill, or is this something?
Well, arguably I did, but one of the facets of my development was in junior high. I became entranced by debate, and in high school, I was very successful, and I was also involved in drama, where I was also pretty successful, and I was always a writer. I mean, I'm fairly prolific. I still write on Quora constantly, but I've always been a communicator, and I've always been understood that if you can't persuade other people to understand how you're seeing things, that nothing's going to happen because you're limited to what you yourself can do as an individual. And if you're very lucky, you partner with a group of people that have a similar vision, but it's still a small group effort. If you're going to really have an impact, you have to be able to communicate. And so I encourage people that I mentor that don't sort of have those skills to get involved with something like Toastmasters or something where they can where speaking becomes second nature, and some kind of improv. I send people to improv a lot too.
Well, and again, here you've done so much and taken those left-hand turns, sometimes jumped right without looking. And yet, with all of this, you spent 15 years with one organization. There had to have been, whether it's leadership or vision, what kept you there?
Well, there were a couple of things. One is that my son's mom had some very complicated medical stuff, and he was born right around the time that I started there. I guess I'd been there a couple of years. So some stability was necessary, but even that wasn't adequate inducement, as the legal term of art goes. For me, it was that I had the same desk and I had the same phone number and the same email, but I ran like 7 different companies for these guys. I did 15 merger and acquisition plays. It was something different every day.
And so with that, and being on the leadership and running these organizations, what do you think is the most important traits that you bring as a leader, whether you walk into an established company, you build a company?
I'm curious is the number one.
Curiosity.
Is because I want to know, particularly if I'm coming into someplace, frequently I'd just like come in and someone would plop a bunch of paper on my desk and we own these guys now, figure out what to do with them, right? And I was like, oh, friggin' great. Who are you? How'd you get here? What's the backstory? Who thought this was a good idea and why? Where did it go wrong? Who didn't see the iceberg? Right? How do we prevent that? So I'm curious, number one, and I listen a lot. I truly believe that in many instances I probably have got the answer, but I'm never sure about that until I've listened to everybody. As a consultant, one of the things I learned was that no matter how bad the problem was inside the company that I was consulting for, somebody inside the company had the answer and they just weren't being listened to. And who is that individual and why are they not being listened to? Because that's the thing I have to fix. So that was a big piece of it. The other thing is that I understood very, very early on that as an executive, my only job is to remove all the obstacles for my people.
Oh, that's beautifully said. Wow.
That's it. There was a book that was super popular in the late 80s called Soul of a New Machine by Tracy Kidder. And it was about the origin, or about the process of creating this new computer system at Data General. And there's this guy, Tom West, who kind of brackets the book. Tracy meets him in a yacht race, and this guy's like intensity and focus and ability to get the yacht through this horrible storm in the off the coast of New England just captivate him. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? What does he do for a living? And then we go through the story of building this computer. And at the end, it's bracketed because he eventually leaves the team and goes and does something else. And after he leaves, people discovered that in the background, he's been doing all this stuff necessary to get this thing out the door that nobody even knew was there, like figuring out what kind of power cord to use and what kind of power cord in all the different countries and the paint and how to get the packaging so that you can ship. I mean, all the and from all that stuff all the way down to like arranging for H-1B visas for some of the engineers and all this background stuff that nobody saw because he was so adept at just doing it and smoothing the path for them. And I read that. I was still an undergrad, and I read that, and it made an enormous impact on me about thinking about teams and leadership. And I looked for that in the leaders that I resonated with, that ability to make it possible for me to get my job done.
And then as that leader, because again, you surround yourself with similar people, and this podcast is called Hiring for Good. Talk about how you hire and how do you know it's the right fit?
That's a super good question. I'll lead by saying that when I'm building a new company, my first hire is HR, and my second hire is accounting. Apart from founders, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you get either of those two things wrong, you're just screwed. Right?
Yes.
And
it's a very engineering approach. It's very wise. It's like and structural, yes.
But at the same time, most of my technically minded cohort are like, oh, I'm looking for a chief engineer for this and a guy that can do machine learning that. And I'm like, doesn't really matter, dude, right? You're going to screw up, get them on board. You're going to have problems. You're going to compensate them wrong. You're going to not have the right agreements in place. It's just like all the things. So frankly, it's hard to characterize because I recruit for capability and possibilities rather than proven track record.
Yeah.
Right. And remember, I'm creating a future that doesn't exist.
It's so interesting because, I don't know how familiar you are with our company, but we have a very successful track record of placement. And part of the reason that our placements stick is because we recruit based on culture, values and goals alignment first, skill set second. They have to. The leader coming in has to fit with the company. But if you're building a company from nothing, I'm like, tell me, it's a different paradigm.
It's a completely different thing. But a lot of it is, I joke about Management by Tom Sawyer, right? Because I'm really good at getting other people to
this is great.
I'm really good at getting other people to paint my fence, right? And there's an element of that. It's like a lot of it is like, this is what we're here for. This is where we're going. There's a third star to the left and sail on to morning, right? Mm-hmm. It's how are we getting there? I don't know. We'll figure it out. Mm-hmm. Well, I need somebody that can do this. Okay, let's find somebody that can do that. Is that somebody we should own, or is that somebody we should contract? Mm-hmm. Is this an ongoing core skill, or is this something that we need to solve a problem today? Because I don't want to own that guy, right? Mm-hmm. I'm very surgical in the way that I think about that stuff. The people that make the core team, the people that are the center of this have got to be ethically aligned. They've got to be aligned in intent and purpose, and they've got to be, more importantly to me, aligned in the way that they see the rest of the employees. right? They're not replaceable cogs. They're not disposable. They're real people with real lives and real skills and interests above what they show up to work with, right? And so I'm kind of looking around the edges of the resume, and I'm trying to figure out now, like, what do you do for fun? How do you manage your life? Do you have side projects? What's motivating you? What's the thing that you would? Because ultimately, I describe my aspiration is to be paid to do something I would pay to do, right? And so I'm looking for those.
I'm going to have you say that again.
I want to be paid to do something I would pay to do.
I like that.
I like it too.
Because if you love what you're doing,
you'll never work a day in your life.
That's right.
As the saying goes. But I recruit for capability. Now, if I'm turning a company around, a lot of times it's a little different.
Yeah.
Because it's like I've got stuff that's actually on fire.
Yeah.
And there's a joke in my industry. It's like, why did elephants have flat feet? No, why did ducks have flat feet?
Why?
To stamp out fires. Why do elephants have flat feet?
Why?
To stamp out burning ducks.
Pretty good.
So I'm typically looking for elephants, and because I've got a bunch of burning ducks, and it's so that's a different thing. There's point skills that I need. And a lot of times I get into companies that are seriously out of compliance in some way, and that was the iceberg that they hit. And of course, I need specialists for that.
right.
But for the most part, if I'm building a new company, I am recruiting for capability. I'm recruiting because it's like. God, kids ask me all the time, what programming language should I learn? And I'm like, I don't really care.
Yeah.
I've forgotten how many programming languages I've used. If you know what you're doing, if you understand the theoretical underpinnings of computation and how to algorithmically break things down and how systems work, you can pick up a language.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
And I'm going to summarize what you said. You said curiosity, humility, because again, no egos, treat people well. Vision, you brought up vision. It doesn't matter how we do it, but this is where we're getting there. Capabilities and possibilities, and lastly, compassion.
Yeah, those are the critical elements for me.
I think we've just had a master class, honestly. I know. We have one more question.
I have kind of a great ending question too.
Sure.
Who are your heroes, and who do you aspire to be?
Okay, so one of my heroes is Bill Lear.
Bill Lear.
Bill Lear. So Bill is a case study in all kinds of things. He at the time that he was born, there was an actual theorem in electrical engineering about the minimum size of an antenna for a radio. And this is taught like in second year electrical engineering classes in college, right? Bill drops out of school in the 6th grade because he has to work to support his family. But he's fascinated by this radio stuff. And he's got a car. He's got a crappy car. And he decides he wants to put a radio in his car. And so Bill builds a radio that he can put in his car. That is actually the origin of Motorola.
Get out. I had no idea.
And he's one of the 2 co-founders of Motorola. And he didn't have any idea that the laws of physics said that he couldn't do what he just did. He just figured it out, right? And he went on to do the Learjet was the same kind of thing. People are like, that'll never work. It's kind of like bumblebees. Well, that's stop bumblebees from flying. So Bill bludgeoned his people into figuring out how to make a small jet work. And 8-track tape, he invented that too, right?
I knew about the jet just
I didn't know
because
about the
name.
8-track.
Yeah, I did know,
that.
And the thing is that at the time, 8-track tape actually had better sound quality than cassette because the 8-track tape is moving at a constant velocity. And cassette was hard because if you move the motor at constant speed, the tape doesn't move at constant velocity because as the reel gets bigger or smaller, the velocity changes, right? So being able to have control systems engineered to maintain constant velocity on tape was like a late thing for cassette. And Bill's like, continuous loop, one motor, yeah, okay, this will be fine, right? And they were everywhere in the 70s.
Oh, yeah,
Trust
sure.
me. Yes,
Right,
I
so-
remember those.
So, and again, it was one of those things he just didn't know. He just like, well, I'm going to solve this and go straight to working on. So he was always a big hero of mine because he was this maverick who would have a vision and go for it. Right? And that was he's the tall pole in the tent of that pantheon, right? There's an instructive lesson in that.
Absolutely.
I tell people all the time, when you fully describe something, you've also proscribed things. You've said, this is the way, and by saying this is the way, you've said all these other things are not the way. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What have you left on the table? What have you missed? Are you even remotely curious about that? Because I am.
Yeah.
And when you talk about a legacy and what you would want to either give wisdom, provide this, again, it sounds like it's going back to that curiosity, but I'll have you put in your words. What do you want your legacy to be?
I've quietly been the man behind the curtain on a whole bunch of stuff. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with that. I don't need like a monument or a statue or anything. I've got a collection of friends and collaborators and people that I value who value me, and the impact that I've had on their lives, that's my legacy.
That's amazing. And we're going to call you the Wizard of Oz.
Thank you so much. I mean, I feel like I could just sit and ask you questions for a really much longer time than this. We may have to have you back. Yes,
part
please.
2.
Every month.
Part 2.
Yes, we'll have to get into all, we didn't talk a ton about hiring, but I don't even care because this is so, really like the philosophy that you're bringing to your work and to your teams and to the things that you're passionate about is really like a framework for how to approach and I just really resonate with it.
And leadership and vision, and you hire the right person, and look what you've accomplished. Absolutely.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh my gosh. Let's do it again. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today at Hiring for Good. If you were inspired by our conversation, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to learn more about our executive search services, check us out at www.hiringforgood.net or our company website, Acumen Executive Search.
Thanks so much, and don't forget to join us next time for another in-depth conversation about transformational leadership. Until then, have fun.